The summer evening in Cedar Grove was like any other, with the setting sun casting long shadows across the clean suburban streets. Mayor Marcus Thompson was driving home from his community basketball game, still wearing his casual clothes, a plain gray t-shirt and black basketball shorts. It was a side of him most citizens never saw, used to their mayor in crisp suits and ties. Marcus had taken his usual route home in his black BMW sedan, thinking about the dinner his wife Sarah had promised to cook. The car's air conditioning felt good against his skin, still warm from the game. He was tired but happy, having spent quality time with old friends away from the pressures of running the city. At exactly 7:45 p.m., red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. Officer James Barrett sat in his patrol car, watching the black BMW he had just pulled over. He had been having a bad day. His divorce papers had arrived that morning, and his supervisor had criticized his latest report. The BMW had been going exactly at the speed limit, but Barrett claimed later he saw it drift slightly over the yellow line. "Control, I'm conducting a traffic stop on Oak Street. Black BMW, license plate XRG 842. Barrett spoke into his radio, his voice carrying the authority of his 15 years on the force. Marcus Thompson pulled over properly, turning on his interior lights and placing both hands on the steering wheel, actions his father had taught him long ago. He watched in his side mirror as Officer Barrett approached, noting how the officer's hand rested on his gun holster. "License and registration," Barrett demanded, not even offering the greeting. His flashlight beam shot directly into Marcus's eyes, making him squint. "Good evening, officer," Marcus replied calmly, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the officer's rudeness. "My registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for it now, if that's okay." Barrett didn't respond, just kept his flashlight beam steady. Marcus moved slowly, deliberately, getting his documents together. He had been in situations like this before, though not since becoming mayor 2 years ago. "Here you go, sir," Marcus said, handing over his license and registration. Barrett barely glanced at the documents. "Step out of the vehicle." "May I ask why, officer? I don't believe I violated any traffic laws." "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." Barrett's voice grew harder, his free hand moving to unclasp his holster. Marcus knew his rights but also knew arguing could make things worse. He carefully opened his door and stepped out, standing straight but non-threatening. At 6 feet tall, he was exactly Officer Barrett's height. "Turn around. Hands on the car." "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Mayor Thompson." "Yeah, and I'm the president," Barrett interrupted with a sneer. "Hands on the car, or we're going to have a problem." Marcus felt the familiar mixture of anger and resignation rising in his chest. Despite being the highest-ranking official in the city, he was still, first and foremost, a black man being confronted by a hostile white officer. What happened next would be viewed thousands of times on social media. Barrett's body camera recorded him roughly handcuffing Marcus, ignoring his calm statements about being the mayor. The officer's language grew increasingly hostile, peppered with supple racial comments about "you people" and "knowing your place." Even as Barrett pushed him into the back of the patrol car, Marcus maintained his composure. He noticed young teenagers recording with their phones from across the street. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person of color who had ever faced similar treatment. As they drove toward the police station, Marcus remained silent, watching his city pass by through the window. He thought about his wife, who would be wondering why he was late. He thought about his teenage son, who had experienced his first racial profiling just months ago. Most of all, he thought about how this incident, painful as it was, might finally force his city to confront its long-standing issues with racial bias in law enforcement. Officer Barrett drove on, unaware that his actions that evening would soon spark a chain of events that would change not only his life, but the entire city of Cedar Grove forever. The fluorescent lights of Cedar Grove Police Station buzzed overhead as Officer Barrett marched Mayor Thompson through the front doors at 8:15 p.m. The evening shift was usually quiet, with Desk Sergeant Maria Rodriguez catching up on paperwork while sipping her third coffee of the day. "Got a troublemaker here," Barrett announced proudly, pushing Marcus forward. "Resisting arrest and giving attitude during a routine traffic stop." Maria looked up from her computer, and her coffee cup froze halfway to her mouth. Her eyes widened in shock as she recognized the handcuffed man in gym clothes. "Oh my God, she whispered, then louder, "Officer Barrett, that's Mayor Thompson." Barrett laughed. "Yeah, right. He already tried that line. Take those handcuffs off him right now." Maria jumped up from her desk, her face flushed with panic. "That is literally our mayor." The color drained from Barrett's face as Maria rushed around her desk, fumbling with her phone. She quickly pulled up the city's website, showing Barrett the official photograph of Mayor Marcus Thompson. "Aye, but he wasn't dressed like..." Barrett stammered, his confident demeanor crumbling. Marcus stood quietly, still handcuffed, watching the realization spread across Barrett's face like a slow-moving wave. Other officers began gathering around, whispering among themselves. Some pulled out their phones, already seeing social media exploding with videos of the arrest. "Chief Anderson needs to be called immediately," Maria said, already dialing the number. Her hands were shaking. In her 20 years on the force, she had never seen such a massive mistake. Within 10 minutes, Police Chief David Anderson burst through the doors, still wearing his dinner jacket. He had left his wedding anniversary celebration the moment he got Maria's call. "Mr. Mayor," he said, his voice filled with horror and embarrassment, "I cannot begin to express." "The handcuffs first, please," Marcus said calmly, speaking for the first time since entering the station. "Then we can talk." Barrett, who had been standing frozen in place, finally moved to remove the handcuffs. His hands were trembling so badly he could barely work the key. As soon as the handcuffs came off, Chief Anderson led Marcus to his private office, shooting a deadly glare at Barrett. The other officers in the station alternated between staring at Barrett and checking their phones, where the video of the arrest was already going viral. "Someone get the body cam footage." Chief Anderson shouted from his office. "Now." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. The footage was pulled and reviewed, showing clearly how Barrett had racially profiled the mayor, ignored his identification, and used unnecessary force. Each viewing made Barrett sink lower in his chair, as his fellow officers walked past him with looks of disgust and disappointment. Meanwhile, in the chief's office, Marcus sat calmly, holding an ice pack to his wrist where the handcuffs had been too tight. He had already called his wife Sarah, assuring her he was safe. Now he watched as Chief Anderson paced back and forth, alternating between apologies and promises of immediate action. "I want him fired," Anderson declared. "Today, right now." "No," Marcus said quietly, causing Anderson to stop pacing. "That's not the solution." "But sir, what he did is something that happens to people who look like me every day," Marcus finished. "The only difference is, I'm the mayor, so people are paying attention." Outside the office, Barrett sat at an empty desk, his head in his hands. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from reporters, fellow officers, and angry citizens who had seen the video. His career was over, he thought. Maybe it should be. As the night grew later, more people arrived at the station, city council members, community leaders, and local reporters. But Marcus remained in the chief's office, thinking carefully about his next steps. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake anymore. This was an opportunity to address the deeper problems in his city's police force. Just before midnight, Marcus finally stood up to leave. As he walked through the station, officers and staff members fell silent, watching their mayor pass. Barrett was still at the desk, looking broken and defeated. Marcus paused briefly beside him. "Officer Barrett," he said softly, "this isn't over. But what happens next depends on whether you're willing to learn from it." With those words hanging in the air, Mayor Thompson walked out of the police station, knowing that tomorrow would bring both challenges and opportunities for real change in Cedar Grove. By 6 o'clock a.m. the next morning, the story of Mayor Thompson's wrongful arrest was everywhere. Cedar Grove, usually a quiet city that rarely made national news, suddenly found itself in the spotlight. Sarah Thompson watched her husband getting ready for work, worried about the dark circles under his eyes. Neither of them had slept much. Their phones hadn't stopped ringing since last night. "Maybe you should stay home today," she suggested, but Marcus shook his head. "A mayor doesn't hide," he said, straightening his tie, "especially not today." Outside their house, news vans lined the street. Reporters stood with microphones and cameras, ready to pounce. Their teenage son Jason peeked through the curtains, counting at least 6 different TV stations. "Dad, you're trending on Twitter," Jason said, holding up his phone. The body cam video has over 2 million views already. The video had spread like wildfire across social media. In it, Officer Barrett's prejudiced behavior was clear for everyone to see. People were especially angry about the moment when he mocked Mayor Thompson's claim about being the mayor. At the police station, things weren't any better. Officer Barrett arrived to find his locker covered in printed copies of news headlines. Someone had written Race ST in big red letters across his nameplate. Chief Anderson called an emergency meeting of all officers. The briefing room was packed, with tension thick in the air. Barrett sat alone in the back, while other officers moved their chairs away from him. "This is a disaster," Anderson announced, throwing a stack of newspapers on the desk. Every front page showed the same story. Local papers, state papers, even the New York Times had picked it up. Meanwhile, at City Hall, Marcus walked through the front doors exactly at 8:00 a.m., just like any other day. But today was different. The usually quiet building was buzzing with activity. Staff members stopped to stare as he passed, some offering words of support, others just looking embarrassed. His secretary, Linda, met him at his office door with tears in her eyes. "Sir, you have over 200 interview requests. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, they all want to talk to you." Marcus nodded calmly. "Schedule a press conference for noon. Everyone can hear what I have to say at once." By 11:30 a.m., the steps of City Hall were packed with reporters and cameras. People from the community started showing up too. Black residents held signs supporting the mayor. Some white residents wore shirts saying "Not all cops." The crowd grew larger and louder. Inside, Marcus prepared his speech carefully. He knew his words would be important. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever been wrongly targeted by police. At exactly noon, Mayor Thompson stepped out to face the cameras. The crowd fell silent. Hundreds of phones went up to record him. "Yesterday evening," he began, his voice strong and clear, "I was wrongfully arrested by one of our city's police officers. But my story is not unique. The only thing unique about this situation is that it happened to the mayor." As he spoke, the video of his arrest played on millions of screens across the country. Social media exploded with new hashtags. #JusticeForMayor, #CedarGroveShem, and #FireBarrett were trending nationwide. Back at the police station, Officer Barrett watched the press conference on a small TV in the break room. Other officers walked past without looking at him. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from old friends and family members, all asking how he could have done something so stupid. By the end of the day, the story had reached international news. Papers in London and Tokyo were writing about the racist American cop who arrested his own mayor. Cedar Grove became a symbol of everything wrong with policing in America. But Mayor Thompson wasn't finished. As evening fell, he sat in his office, working on a new plan. His phone rang. It was the governor, calling to offer support. On his computer screen, he had already started drafting new police reform policies. "Sir," Linda called from the door, "Officer Barrett's wife is here. She wants to apologize in person." Marcus looked up from his work. "Send her in," he said. "It's time we started bringing this community back together." The sun set on Cedar Grove, but the story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. 1 week after the arrest, the Cedar Grove Police Department's Internal Affairs Office looked like a war room. Detective Sarah Chen sat surrounded by stacks of files, every case Officer Barrett had handled in the past 5 years. "This doesn't look good," she muttered, adding another file to the growing pile on her right. That pile represented cases where Barrett had arrested black drivers during routine traffic stops. It was much bigger than the pile on her left. The police department had started a full investigation into Barrett's past conduct. Chief Anderson had ordered them to check everything: arrest records, complaint forms, body camera footage, and even old social media posts. Detective Chen's phone buzzed. Another officer had found something important. "You need to see this," the message read. "Break room, now." In the break room, Officer Michael Rodriguez, Maria's younger brother, had pulled up old footage from Barrett's body camera. The video showed Barrett stopping a black teenager 2 months ago for looking suspicious. The boy had just been walking home from basketball practice. "How did we miss this?" Michael asked, shaking his head. "It was right in front of us." More officers started coming forward with stories. Officer Lisa Thompson, no relation to the mayor, remembered how Barrett often made racist jokes in the locker room. "We all just laughed it off," she said during her interview. "We didn't want to cause trouble." By mid-afternoon, Detective Chen's office had received 15 new complaints about Barrett. People who had been arrested by him in the past were calling to share their stories. Each one showed a similar pattern. Meanwhile, Barrett sat at home on paid leave. His wife had taken their kids to stay with her parents. The news vans were still parked outside his house. He spent his days watching TV and ignoring calls from reporters. The police union was caught in the middle. They usually defended officers automatically, but this case was different. The union president, Tom Miller, called an emergency meeting. "We can't defend the indefensible," Miller told the union board. "The evidence is too clear. If we stand behind Barrett, we'll lose all credibility." Back at the station, Chief Anderson reviewed the growing pile of evidence on his desk. Barrett's record showed that he pulled over black drivers 8 times more often than white drivers. His arrest rates showed similar problems. "It's not just about that one night anymore," Anderson told his deputy chief. "This is about years of bad behavior that we should have caught sooner." The investigation also revealed something unexpected. Several rookie officers said Barrett had taught them to look for certain suspicious behaviors during traffic stops. These behaviors seemed to target minority drivers unfairly. By the end of the week, Detective Chen had finished her preliminary report. It was 30 pages long and included evidence from over 50 cases. She dropped it on Chief Anderson's desk Friday afternoon. "Sir," she said, "there's something else you should know. We found old text messages between Barrett and 3 other officers. They're not good." Anderson opened the file and started reading. His face grew darker with each page. The messages showed that Barrett wasn't acting alone. There was a small group of officers who shared his views and protected each other. Just then, Mayor Thompson walked into the office. He had been keeping close watch on the investigation all week. "How bad is it?" he asked, seeing their serious faces. "Worse than we thought," Anderson replied, handing him the report. "It's not just Barrett. We have a bigger problem." Mayor Thompson sat down and started reading. The room was quiet except for the sound of turning pages. Outside the office, officers tried to peek in through the blinds, wondering what would happen next. Finally, the mayor looked up. "Chief Anderson," he said slowly, "I think it's time we cleaned house. All of it." Anderson nodded. He had been thinking the same thing. This wasn't just about firing one racist cop anymore. The whole department needed to change. As the sun set on another long day, Detective Chen added one final note to her report. Recommendation: complete departmental overhaul required. She underlined it twice before closing the file. The investigation had revealed ugly truths, but at least now they couldn't be ignored. Change was coming to Cedar Grove, whether people were ready or not. The Cedar Grove Community Center had never been so full. By 6:00 p.m., every seat was taken, and people were standing along the walls. Mayor Thompson had called for a town hall meeting, and it seemed like the whole city had shown up. The room was clearly divided. On one side sat mostly black and minority residents, many wearing Black Lives Matter t-shirts. On the other side were police officers in civilian clothes and their supporters. In the middle, a group of uncertain citizens looked back and forth between the two sides. Sarah Thompson, the mayor's wife, watched from the front row as her husband adjusted the microphone. Behind him, a large screen showed pictures of Cedar Grove's history, including old photos of the first black family to move into the city in 1962. "Look who's here," whispered Jason, the mayor's son, pointing toward the back. Officer Barrett's family had just walked in. His wife Jenny looked nervous, holding their 10-year-old daughter's hand tightly. Their teenage son walked behind them, wearing his hood up to hide his face. The room got quiet as Mayor Thompson began to speak. "2 weeks ago," he said, "I was wrongfully arrested. But tonight isn't about me. It's about us, all of us, and the kind of city we want to be." In the audience, Mrs. Johnson, an elderly black woman, stood up slowly. "I've lived here for 50 years, she said, her voice shaking. "My grandson was stopped by police 3 times last month, just for walking home from work at night. When will it stop?" Several police officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them, Officer Lisa Thompson, raised her hand to speak next. I've been on the force for 12 years, she said. We're not all like Barrett. Some of us are trying to do the right thing. Then why didn't you stop him? Someone shouted from the back. The meeting could have turned ugly then, but something unexpected happened. Jenny Barrett stood up, still holding her daughter's hand. My husband was wrong, she said, her voice quiet but clear. I always knew he had these beliefs. I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry. The room fell silent. Nobody had expected Barrett's wife to speak up. Her daughter looked up at her with wide eyes, while their son sank lower in his seat. An older white man in a business suit stood next. I'd known James Barrett for 20 years, he said. He coached my kids in Little League. I never thought he was racist, but now, I've been thinking about all the little comments he made over the years. Things I just laughed off. Maybe we're all part of the problem. More people started sharing their stories. A Hispanic teenager talked about being followed around stores by security guards. A white mother admitted she had crossed the street when she saw young black men walking toward her. Chief Anderson listened carefully to every story. He had brought the internal investigation report with him, and now he stood up to speak. We found evidence of systematic bias in our department, he announced. It wasn't just one officer. We need to change everything, our training, our policies, our culture. But we need your help to do it right. Mayor Thompson then unveiled his new plan. He wanted to create a community oversight board, regular citizens who would review police conduct. He also proposed new training programs and stricter rules about body cameras. But most importantly, he said, we need to talk to each other, really talk, and really listen. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end, something had changed in the room. People who had sat on opposite sides were now standing in mixed groups, talking quietly. Jenny Barrett and her daughter walked up to Mrs. Johnson. The old woman hesitated for a moment, then hugged the crying child. As people left the community center, Mayor Thompson noticed his son Jason talking to Barrett's son in the parking lot. The two teenagers had gone to the same school, but had never spoken before. That's how it starts, Sarah said, following her husband's gaze. One conversation at a time. The street lights came on as the last people left the community center. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. But tonight, for the first time since the arrest, there was hope in Cedar Grove. Real change felt possible, not just necessary. Officer James Barrett sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the suspension letter from the police department. 3 weeks had passed since the night he arrested Mayor Thompson. His house was quiet, too quiet. His wife and kids were still living with her parents. The TV played quietly in the background, showing yet another news story about police reform in Cedar Grove. Barrett reached for the remote to turn it off but stopped when he saw his own face on the screen. It was his old police photo, next to a picture of Mayor Thompson in handcuffs. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Chief Anderson. Mandatory sensitivity training starts tomorrow. 9 a.m. sharp. Don't be late. Barrett almost didn't go. He thought about quitting, maybe moving to another city where nobody knew his name. But when morning came, he found himself putting on civilian clothes and driving to the police training center. The training room was half full when he arrived. Some officers turned away when they saw him. Others just stared. Barrett took a seat in the back corner, trying to make himself invisible. The trainer was Dr. Michael Williams, a black psychologist who specialized in racial bias. He didn't start with lectures or PowerPoint slides. Instead, he showed videos of real people sharing their experiences with police. Watch carefully, Dr. Williams said. These could be your neighbors, your children's teachers, or even your mayor. Barrett felt his face get hot when Mayor Thompson appeared on screen, telling his story. But this time, Thompson wasn't just talking about the arrest. He talked about teaching his teenage son how to act around police, about the fear he felt every time he saw flashing lights in his mirror. During the lunch break, Barrett sat alone in his car. He pulled out his phone and looked at old photos of his kids. His daughter's last text message still hurt. Dad, why does everyone at school say you're racist? The afternoon session was harder. Dr. Williams had invited several black police officers to share their stories. Officer Marcus Jones, a rookie Barrett had trained last year, stood up to speak. I wanted to say something every time you made those comments, Jones said, looking directly at Barrett. But I was afraid of losing my job. Do you know what that feels like? To stay quiet while someone insults who you are. For the first time, Barrett felt something crack inside him. He remembered all the jokes he used to tell, all the times he pulled over black drivers for no real reason. He thought about Mayor Thompson's calm dignity that night compared to his own anger and prejudice. After the session, Barrett stayed behind. Dr. Williams was packing up his materials when Barrett approached him. "I need help," Barrett said quietly. "I don't want to be this person anymore." The next few weeks were the hardest of Barrett's life. Every day brought new revelations about his past behavior. He started attending extra counseling sessions with Dr. Williams. He joined a support group for police officers working to overcome racial bias. One evening, he got an unexpected call from Jenny. She wanted to come over and talk. When she arrived, she found Barrett surrounded by books about civil rights history and racial justice. "James," she said, looking around in surprise, "what are you doing?" "Learning," he replied, "really learning, for the first time." That weekend, Barrett wrote 2 letters. The first was to Mayor Thompson, asking for a chance to apologize in person. The second was to every black person he had wrongfully arrested over the years. Mayor Thompson's response came quickly. "Tomorrow, 2 p.m., my office." When Barrett walked into City Hall, people still stared and whispered. But this time he understood why. He wasn't the victim here. He was the person who needed to change. The mayor's office was bright and welcoming. Thompson sat behind his desk, looking at Barrett with steady eyes. "Officer Barrett," he said, "I hear you've been doing some hard work." Barrett nodded, his throat tight. "Sir, I can't undo what I did, but I'm trying to be better. To do better." Thompson smiled slightly. "That's all any of us can do. Now, let's talk about how you can help make real changes in our department." As they talked, the afternoon sun streamed through the windows. Outside, Cedar Grove was changing. Inside, James Barrett was changing too, one difficult conversation at a time. 3 months after the arrest incident, Mayor Thompson stood at the front of City Hall's main conference room. The walls were covered with charts, statistics, and new police department policies. Every seat was filled with city council members, community leaders, and police officers. Today, Thompson announced, Cedar Grove takes its first real step toward change. He clicked a button, and the big screen behind him showed the new Cedar Grove Police Reform Act. 6 months of work had gone into this document. Chief Anderson sat in the front row, nodding as the mayor began explaining the changes. First, Thompson said, "Every officer will wear a body camera that cannot be turned off during shifts. The footage will be reviewed weekly by our new Community Oversight Board." In the back of the room, Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman from the town hall meeting, smiled. She had been chosen as one of the board members, along with 11 other citizens from different parts of the community. Second, the mayor continued, "We're changing how we hire and train officers. Dr. Williams will lead our new 3-month training program focusing on community relations and bias prevention." Dr. Williams, who had been working with Officer Barrett, stood up briefly. Some officers looked uncomfortable, but others were already taking notes. Third, we're creating the Citizens Response Team. When someone calls 911, trained social workers will respond alongside police officers to help handle sensitive situations. Sarah Thompson watched her husband with pride. He had worked late every night for months to make this happen. Even their son Jason had helped, sharing ideas about how to connect with younger residents. Suddenly, the room grew quiet as James Barrett walked in. He looked different now, humble, less sure of himself. He had been invited to speak about his experience in the new training program. Barrett walked to the podium slowly. His hands were shaking as he adjusted the microphone. 6 months ago, I was the problem," he began. "But thanks to Dr. Williams and Mayor Thompson, I learned to see my own prejudices. Now I want to help other officers avoid my mistakes." The new policies weren't easy for everyone to accept. Some older officers complained about the changes. 2 had already quit in protest, but most understood that times were changing. Chief Anderson stood up next, showing slides of the department's new community programs. Officers would coach youth sports teams, attend neighborhood meetings, and walk regular beats to get to know residents. "We're also changing our traffic stop procedures," Anderson explained. "Officers must call in their reason for stopping a vehicle before making contact with the driver. All stops will be reviewed monthly for racial bias." In the middle of the presentation, Barrett's ex-wife Jenny slipped into the room with their children. Their teenage son had finally stopped wearing his hood up in public. Their daughter was wearing a Cedar Grove United t-shirt. Mayor Thompson noticed them and smiled. Healing was happening in small ways throughout the city. The next speaker was Officer Lisa Thompson, now promoted to lead the new training division. Starting next week, she announced, every officer will spend time living in different neighborhoods, learning about the communities they serve. Some reporters in the back of the room were writing quickly, knowing this story would make national news again. Cedar Grove was becoming a model for other cities struggling with similar problems. After the presentation, people gathered in small groups to talk. Black residents chatted with police officers about neighborhood concerns. White citizens listened to stories they had never heard before. Barrett's daughter ran up to give him a quick hug before leaving with her mom. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything to him. He was working hard to earn back his family's trust. Mayor Thompson ended the meeting with a final announcement. The Justice Department has chosen Cedar Grove as a pilot city for their new police reform program. They'll be watching our progress and sharing our methods with other cities. As people filed out of City Hall, there was a feeling of hope in the air. Signs of change were everywhere, from the new diverse faces in police uniforms to the community gardens being planted in once troubled neighborhoods. It's a good start, Thompson told his wife as they walked to their car. But we're not finished yet. Sarah squeezed his hand. No, she agreed, but at least now we're moving in the right direction. The sun was setting over Cedar Grove, casting long shadows across the city. It was still a work in progress, but something new was growing here, something that could show other cities the way forward. 1 year had passed since that fateful night when Officer Barrett had arrested Mayor Thompson. Cedar Grove looked different now, not just on the surface, but deep down where it really mattered. Mayor Thompson stood at his office window, watching kids playing basketball with police officers in the new community center across the street. Among them was James Barrett, no longer in uniform but wearing a community mentor t-shirt, teaching a young black boy how to shoot free throws. "Sir," his secretary Linda called from the door, "the news crew is here for your interview." Today was special. National TV stations had come to Cedar Grove to report on what people were calling the Cedar Grove miracle. Crime rates were down. Complaints against police had dropped by 80%. Other cities were sending their officers here to learn. In the interview room, Thompson sat across from a famous news anchor. Behind them, photos showed the changes of the past year. Black and white officers having dinner together in people's homes, kids high-fiving police at school, community meetings where everyone sat mixed together instead of taking sides. "Mayor Thompson," the anchor began, "1 year ago, you were wrongfully arrested by a racist officer. Now Cedar Grove is being called America's most progressive police force. How did you do it?" Thompson smiled, remembering everything that had happened. "We did it together," he said. "Every person in this city helped make the change." Across town, James Barrett was finishing up his basketball session. After losing his badge, he had found a new purpose. He now worked full-time with Dr. Williams, talking to police departments around the country about changing their ways. His daughter, once ashamed of him, now brought her friends to watch him coach. His son had started a student group at school called Future Officers for Change. Even Jenny, his ex-wife, had begun to see him differently. At the police station, Chief Anderson was giving a tour to visitors from Chicago. The walls showed their new statistics proudly. 0 racial bias complaints in 6 months. Perfect body camera compliance. Higher arrest rates for actual crimes, lower rates for minor violations. The secret, Anderson told the visitors, was admitting we had a problem and really wanting to fix it. Officer Lisa Thompson, now Captain Thompson, ran the department's training program. Today she was teaching a class of new recruits, including 3 black officers, 2 Hispanic officers, and several women. "Remember," she told them, "we're here to protect and serve everyone equally. No exceptions." In the afternoon, Mayor Thompson had another special meeting. The Community Oversight Board was celebrating its first anniversary. Mrs. Johnson, still sharp at 75, read out their yearly report. "In 1 year," she announced proudly, "we've reviewed over 5,000 police interactions. We praised 200 officers for outstanding community service. And we've helped identify and retrain 15 officers who showed signs of bias." The mayor checked his watch. He had one more stop to make. Every month, he and James Barrett spoke to high school students together, telling their story and teaching young people about both rights and responsibilities. Today's class was special. Barrett's son and Thompson's son sat together in the front row. Once enemies because of their fathers, they were now close friends and co-leaders of the school's social justice club. A year ago, Barrett told the students, "I was the problem. But Mayor Thompson showed me that anyone can change if they really want to." Thompson added, "And Mr. Barrett showed us that when people admit their mistakes and work to fix them, wonderful things can happen." After school, Thompson drove home slowly, looking at his city. The police cars had new logos. Protecting with respect, officers walked their beats in pairs, one white, one minority. Store windows displayed signs reading Cedar Grove United. At home, Sarah was waiting with good news. The governor wanted to use Cedar Grove's program as a model for the whole state. And better yet, their son Jason had decided to become a police officer after college. "He says he wants to be part of the new generation," Sarah said proudly. That evening, Thompson sat on his porch, thinking about everything that had changed. A police car drove by slowly, and the officers waved. Nobody felt fear. Nobody felt anger. His phone buzzed with a text from Barrett. "Thank you for giving me a chance to change." Thompson smiled and texted back, "Thank you for showing others it's possible." Cedar Grove had transformed itself from a symbol of racism to a beacon of hope. One arrest had started it all, but it was everyone's commitment to change that had made the miracle happen.